Woromi Bujuri Daramara, which in Darug language, which is the language that of the country that I find myself on, means hello and welcome to everyone. Good day to everyone. My name is Yasmina Bayraktarevich Hayward. I'm the Community Services Coordinator at the New South Wales Service for the Treatment and Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma Survivors. Starts in short. We are very privileged to be able to hold this particular webinar on human rights advocacy, focusing on the Magnitsky Act. We are looking at trying to understand the Act, the origins, the provisions, and the global impact, and we have some fantastic speakers lined up for you. I will hand over to them shortly, but a couple of housekeeping rules. All the questions should be posted in a chat, and Anton, who is our moderator, will be trying to answer, pick up the questions we can. Please keep yourself on mute, but leave your cameras on so that our speakers have human faces to speak to, as opposed to little black squares on the screen. We will also share reference materials in the chat, and this session will be recorded, and recording and all the materials will be also available afterwards. So, yep, I'm on Cabrogal country of the Darug Nation, and I pay my respects to this country and to many countries that you join us from. Over to you, Anton.
Thank you so much, Yasmina, and thank you also to the team at the Diplomacy Training Program for putting this together. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Anton Moisenko, Senior Lecturer in Law at the Australian National University, and it is a particular pleasure to be moderating this event with an excellent team of two heavyweights in the world of sanctions, Sir Bill Browder, KCMG, and Vadim Kleiner. They are respectively the founder and head and chief investigator of the Global Magnitsky Justice Initiative, and also respectively the CEO and director of research at Hermitage Capital Management, which once upon a time was, I believe, the largest foreign investor in Russia. How times have changed. Now, in terms of situating the role of these two men in the development of Magnitsky sanctions, I sometimes think back to my own experience of academic research in this area, starting in 2014 as a PhD student looking at the legal aspects of Magnitsky sanctions. And at that time, the only Magnitsky Act in the world was the original piece of US legislation imposing travel bans and asset freezes on Russian crooks and alleged human rights abusers, a piece of legislation that Vadim and Bill had advocated and pushed for. And it was only a couple of years later, in 2016, that something known as the Global Magnitsky Act was adopted, expanding that approach so that it could target people from anywhere in the world and not only Russia. And I thought at the time that it was a brilliant idea, but really underexplored. And it was roughly, I think, around that time as well, in 2015, that Bill published his first book, Red Notice, that detailed some of his history, his and Vadim's history of fighting for justice in the case of Sergei Magnitsky. And I still remember citing that book in my PhD and then facing that question from one of the examiners, what is that book? And who's Bill Browder? And is it reliable? And I had to explain that pretty much all of the material in that book was also corroborated by other sources, such as, incredibly, Russia's own Human Rights Council, which at the time seems to have had at least some passing interest in human rights. So what we're going to do today is delve deeper in some of that history of the Magnitsky Act, Magnitsky Acts around the world, as they have proliferated and been adopted across a number of different countries, but perhaps not always used as effectively as their advocates would hope they would be utilized. And we're also going to touch on some of the future prospects. So with that introduction, Bill, if I may turn to you first, and noting that you'll have to leave us in around 25 minutes, you've obviously done this groundbreaking work on Magnitsky sanctions, and they bear the name of a former colleague of yours, Sergei Magnitsky. And so who was Sergei Magnitsky, and why are those sanctions in his name?
Well, thank you, Anton. Thank you, Patrick, Jasmina, and the whole team there for organizing this. And Really wonderful to be here in our morning, I guess your evening, or some, I don't know where all you people are all over the world there. Just a little bit of background on me before we get into Sergey, so you understand how he and I are connected, Sergey Magnitsky. I was once the largest foreign investor in Russia. I went to Russia after the Berlin Wall came down. I'm the grandson of the leader of the Communist Party of America, and in my rebellion, I became a capitalist. And when the Berlin Wall came down, I said, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I wanted to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so that's what I set out to do. And I eventually moved to Moscow. I set up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund. And it quickly grew to become the largest investment fund in the country. Vadim Kleiner, who's also on this call, who you hear from after me, joined me about 9 months after I started the fund. And we've been working together ever since. And one of the things that Vadim and I discovered very early on in our career was that all the companies that we invested in Russia were basically corrupt. And we then said, well, how do we, it's not very profitable to invest in corrupt companies. How do we stop the corruption? And we decided to start researching the corruption and exposing it. Well, as you can imagine, that doesn't make you too many friends in Russia. And in 2005, I was expelled from the country and declared a threat to national security after having lived there for 10 years. After I was expelled, our offices were raided. And at that point, I hired a young lawyer named Sergey Magnitsky to investigate why our offices were raided. And what he discovered was that the office raids, which took place in June of 2007, were done in order to confiscate all of our documents, documents of companies that we had used to invest all of our money in Russia. And those documents were then used, based on Sergey's investigation, in a highly complex fraud in which a number of government officials and organized criminals stole $230 million of taxes that my firm paid to the Russian government from the Russian government. Sergey exposed the crime. He testified against the officials involved, and he was subsequently arrested by the same people he testified against, tortured in pretrial detention for 358 days to retract his testimony, which he refused to do, and then killed by 8 riot guards with rubber batons on November 16th, 2009. Sergey Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. His murder was the most traumatic, life-changing thing that could have ever happened to me. Sergey was effectively killed because he was my lawyer. If he hadn't been my lawyer, he'd still be alive today. And so I decided that I was going to give up my life as a businessman, and I was going to devote all of my time, all my energy, and all my resources going after the people who killed him to make sure they face justice. And at first I thought there was a reasonable chance that we would get justice inside of Russia. Sergey had done something very unique and unprecedented during his time in detention, which is he wrote everything down. He wrote down who was doing what to him, when they were doing it, where they were doing it, how they were doing it. And he would write it down in the form of criminal complaints that he would file once a month or so. He'd take this big stack of criminal complaints, share them with his lawyer would file them, and all the complaints would be ignored. However, we had copies of all those complaints. And those complaints, the copies of the complaints, created the most granular record of human rights abuse that's probably ever come out of Russia. And so we said to ourselves, we're going to publicize all this information. And we started sharing it with the local and international media. They wrote these stories, and we thought that it was so shocking to the Russian people that surely at least the low-level executioners would have to be prosecuted. But that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was that the Putin regime circled the wagons. They Putin personally got involved in the case. He publicly exonerated everybody who played a role in this case. And then, in the most shocking miscarriage of justice, they put Sergei Magnitsky on trial 3 years after they killed him, in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. I was his co-defendant. The trial found us both guilty. They couldn't do anything more to him than killing him, but they sentenced me to 9 years in absentia in a Russian prison on the back of that trial. It became obvious that there was no chance of getting justice inside of Russia, so we said, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And that's where I came up with this idea, which now is known as the Magnitsky Act, which is that the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky killed him for money, and they don't keep that money in Russia, they keep that money in the West. And so we came up with this idea of freezing their assets and banning their travel, which became known as the Magnitsky Act. And I took this idea to Washington, and I shared it with two senators, Senator Benjamin Cardin, who was a Democrat from Maryland, and Senator John McCain, a Republican from Arizona. And I said, can we sanction the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky? And they said yes. And they introduced the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act in April of 2010. And the moment that they put this on the books, it was just a proposed law, and there are many proposed laws, but this one really got a lot of attention, and particularly got a lot of attention from people in Russia who went to them and said, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. They commit terrible crimes in Russia, and then they take the proceeds from those crimes and keep them safe in the West. And those people said to these two senators, can we sanction the people who killed my husband, my brother, my sister, my aunt? And after about a dozen of these calls, these two senators said, we're onto something much bigger than Sergei Magnitsky. And they added 65 words to the law to say that the law should sanction all human rights abusers in Russia. And after that, many other people joined the campaign for their own purposes. And after that, many different senators signed up. And when it went for a vote, it passed the Senate 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And it became a federal law on December 14th, 2012. And after it was passed, Putin went out of his mind, literally out of his mind. And he, in retaliation, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families, effectively sentencing certain orphans to death because many orphans were sick orphans and weren't getting the medical care they were needing in Russia. He then went after me and Sergei with these crazy posthumous cases and so on. I've been a fugitive from justice in Russia, or I would put my quotations around justice because it's not real justice. They've issued Interpol arrest warrants for me. They've chased me all around the world with extradition, death threats, kidnapping threats. And with all this craziness, they were hoping that they would intimidate me and intimidate my congressional sponsors, and that perhaps the Magnitsky Act could be repealed. That was Putin's dream. But instead, these two senators said, well, if Putin has gotten such a negative reaction to this thing, and he's going so apoplectic, perhaps we could apply this to other dictators. And that's when they introduced the Global Magnitsky Act. And as Anton mentioned, the Global Magnitsky Act passed in 2016. And now all of a sudden, bad people, bad actors from around the world, anywhere can be sanctioned. And I should point out that the value of these sanctions are the impact, quite devastating. If you're a person who's on the other side of these sanctions, your financial life pretty much comes to an end. The banks all close their accounts for you. Nobody wants to do any business with you. You can't even get a credit card. and you effectively become, and your money gets frozen, and you become a non-person in the world of commerce. And so these sanctions can be really harsh. And I know that because I see the reaction in different countries to people who are sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act, and people are very, very unhappy when they get sanctioned. And not only are the people unhappy, but the people who are not sanctioned, who are afraid of being sanctioned, are also unhappy. It completely terrorizes them. So the Magnitsky Act passed, as I mentioned, in the United States, the Global Magnitsky Act in 2016. A Global Magnitsky Act passed in Canada in 2017, in the UK in 2018, in Australia in 2021, in the European Union in 2020, passed in Iceland, Norway, Kosovo, Montenegro, Jersey, Guernsey, Cayman Islands. There's now 35 countries around the world, plus the British overseas territories that have Magnitsky Acts. And I would say that it's probably the single most important legal development in the world of human rights, probably in the last 25 years, because it finally gives victims some type of redress. And the world that we lived in before that was that unless a country wanted to sanction a whole other country, like the United States had done with Iran, bad guys were untouchable. But now they're very specifically touchable, and a lot of bad guys have been touched. Now there's many, many things connected to the Magnitsky Act which still need to be improved. For example, each country kind of considers their Magnitsky lists sort of independently. And so you can have a person sanctioned in one country and not in another country. And in fact, even Sergei Magnitsky is sanctioned. I mean, the people who killed Sergei are sanctioned in the US, Canada, UK, and Australia, but they're still not sanctioned in the European Union. You also have different laws sort of catching different offenses. So in the European Union, corruption is not part of the Magnitsky Act, although it's a major part of the Magnitsky Act in the US, Canada, UK, and Australia. When the Australians passed the Magnitsky Act, they also added cyber crimes. And so there's a lot of harmonization that needs to be done. And then, of course, the enforcement of the Magnitsky Act is also very frustrating because it's very difficult to get people sanctioned. Sometimes politics get in the way. There are what I euphemistically call, there's the good human rights abusers and the bad human rights abusers. The bad ones, of course, are the ones that are politically out of favor. And the good ones, and there's no such thing as a good human rights abuser, but just using that as sort of a way of describing how it works, are countries that the US or the UK or Australia has good diplomatic relations with, and they don't want to rock the boat. And so there's a lot of frustrations, of course, as there is with anything. But overall, I would say that we're pretty overwhelmed that this legislation, this tragedy, has led to such a global movement.
Thank you. And I think when you speak about this tragedy, it's sometimes easy for an outside observer to just accept that a tragedy happened, there was a reaction. But as you mentioned, the details of what happened to Sergei Magnitsky are so well documented and so outrageous that I think it really hits you, the first time you read about it, and not only the first time. It's an extraordinary case. I wanted to perhaps delve a bit deeper into what you mentioned there as the impact of sanctions, and taking your point about the virtual end of your financial life if you do business internationally and your accounts are frozen and nobody will touch you with a barge pole. I suppose one concern that a lot of people would have is, in a number of those cases, perpetrators are very comfortably ensconced in the economies of their home countries. They might forgo the joy of going on holiday to places that have imposed sanctions and might prosecute them. And I think that one of the things that struck me when I read your book about this is the recognition that, of course, Magnitsky Acts are hardly commensurate to the offense in question. It's the way to get a modicum of justice, but perhaps not necessarily, or clearly not the entire justice. And so I was wondering how you think about the role of those acts as part of a broader strategy to pursue accountability for what happened to Sergei Magnitsky, but also more broadly?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, taking someone's bank account away and not letting them travel is hardly commensurate with slowly torturing a man to death. And that's what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. So that's definitely not, like for like. But so when we went through this process of trying to get justice for Sergei, and it became clear that there was no chance of getting justice inside of Russia, I then started looking for how do you get justice outside of Russia? And what I discovered is that there was no way to get justice outside of Russia. I'm not a trained lawyer. I know you are, Anton, and probably many other people on this call, but I went to a bunch of, eminent lawyers and started probing. And I discovered there was the universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction is this idea that you can prosecute somebody in Germany for a murder they commit in South Sudan, and many countries have it. And I actually had this professor. He was a professor, a law professor, who had decided to take this Magnitsky case and get each person in his class to look at a different jurisdiction and see whether universal jurisdiction would apply. And he came back at the end of the semester with a big report from his students that basically concluded that unless the perpetrator or the victim are a resident in the country that has universal jurisdiction, that it may exist in theory, but it doesn't exist in practice. So universal jurisdiction didn't work. And then I started going around and saying, well, what does work? And the only thing that you could get done in the world of human rights advocacy is if you're really lucky, you can get the State Department to issue a paragraph in the US government's human rights report condemning the murder of so-and-so and such and such. That was like the best you could do. And so that's when I said to myself, I can't live with myself if these people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, can laugh at this and think that they're untouchable. And that's when we said, well, this may not be perfect justice, but it's a hell of a lot better than total impunity. And that's when we came up with this idea of taking their money away. And I should point out that when people in these countries that do these crimes and do them for money, they value money more than human life. And that means, and they steal the money they kill people, they take away a human life in order to get the money. But it also means that money is so valuable to them that if you take away their money, it actually hits them so hard you can't even imagine. So again, I won't be satisfied, and I'm still not satisfied that we've gotten justice for Sergei Magnitsky, but I can at least enjoy the pain that this creates for the people who caused him his suffering and death, and the pain that it causes other people who've done similar types of things.
I realize you'll have to leave in a couple of minutes, so please feel free to break off whatever you need to dash off. But one other question I wanted to ask you, albeit briefly, is about some of the main obstacles or arguments against. In hindsight, it looks almost inevitable that Magnitsky Acts would proliferate. I'm sure it was anything but. So could you say a bit about that?
Well, thank you for asking, because I was just in, I'll tell you just a little anecdote. I was just in Brussels yesterday, and I was working on another sort of type of campaign, which is to confiscate Russia's central bank reserves, frozen $300 billion of central bank reserves for the benefit of Ukraine. And Anton, you and I have talked about this completely in a parallel conversation. And I was at a hearing in the European Parliament, and I sat next to the Belgian ambassador to the EU. And the Belgian ambassador, after I presented and various other people presented the logic of that if a country invades another country, they should, and they have money abroad, that money should be confiscated. And then the Belgian ambassador said, no, it's impossible, we can't do this, blah, 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 blah. And he went through all these bureaucratic, unhelpful and not really very well thought through reasons. And I said to him, everybody said the same thing to me. They said it was impossible for the Magnitsky Act. when I first started lobbying for the Magnitsky Act, they said, we can't do this, it doesn't work, it's against the rule of law, there's no way we can do it, and diplomacy, blah, blah, blah. And every country, everywhere, I mean, you can't imagine the roadblocks. And it took me a good 12 years from start to finish to get 35 countries to do the Magnitsky Act. And everybody stood in my way at every possible place until they didn't. And so I said to him, I said, we're going to be sitting here in a couple of years' time, and you're going to be telling me how great it is that we've confiscated the Russian assets, in the same way as all these people now in governments tell me how wonderful the Magnitsky Act is. And I mean, I can remember in the UK, I couldn't even get a meeting at the Foreign Office, the Foreign Ministry of the UK, because talking about the Magnitsky Act was such a grave sin. Now I'm like a hero inside the Foreign Office. Everyone wants a copy of my book. So the world does change. It hasn't changed completely, but it does change when you fight these fights. And I encourage all the human rights activists here that, however painful whatever you're working on is at the moment, if you stick with it, generally the people against you don't stick with it as much as you stick with it. And you can often accomplish many things that are unimaginable just with tenacity and persistence.
Well, this might be an excellent note on which we can let you go for your many other commitments. So thank you very much again, Sir Bill Browder, for the work that you've been doing and for taking the time to speak to us this morning. And we'll move over to a colleague of yours and a fellow friend in this fight, Vadim Kleiner.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Now, Vadim, you've been an essential collaborator of Bill's in this. And I thought we might perhaps start where Bill left off. I'm not sure you're here, Vadim, because I can't see you.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I had a problem with internet, sorry.
No, that's fine. And I thought we might as well continue that theme of the obstacles that you had to go through as you were talking to people on Capitol Hill and trying to ensure that this idea of accountability for human rights abuse and corruption becomes a reality. It's easy to see the arguments for. What were the arguments against?
I mean, generally, all the governments were pretty much against it, whether it was US government to start with, or UK government, and even Canadian government at the first stance, and so on. So the issue is that they consider it as, first of all, their full discretion, and second, the whole idea of sanctioning specific people for their human rights violation, which was pretty much unheard of. So as Bill mentioned, it was pretty much about countries sanctioning other countries like Iran and so on and so forth, but not about specific persons who were involved in human rights violations. The other arguments, I mean, if you look generally about this story, the story started in the United States when in June 2009, Bill came to the Helsinki Commission for cooperation with Europe and told the whole story of Sergei. And at that time, he was still alive, but his story was so shocking. So the person whom the country should be proud of, the guy who is just ordinary officeman who uncovered corruption and testified against it and testified about officials involved, instead of these officials being punished, especially when we're talking about such huge amount of money as 230 million stolen from the Russian budget, in contrast to that, every one of them were exonerated, and even more so, they were allowed to put a whistleblower, Sergei Magnitsky, in prison. It's such a sound story by itself. But on top of that, what actually moved people is the courage of Sergei. I mean, he was an office clerk. You could imagine the guy who's going to the office every day, just having coffee and tea and working hard there, but not a person who would stand for you as some kind of hero. But his mental capacity and his moral principles happen to be something unheard of. So, there was a Russian, big Russian author, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Once he said that if you are in prison, you should keep down. you should never complain, because this will make your situation only worse. And it was completely the opposite of what Sergei did. Every day he wrote a new complaint, sometimes several complaints. Every day he helped to his cellmates to write their complaints. And so this courage and this story actually so much taught people. I mean, it was something unheard of. And then when in later this year, in November 2009, when his health deteriorated dramatically, and instead of getting medical help, he was beaten to death in Russian prison. And then Bill came to tell this news to the States. I mean, everybody who heard his original story were really shocked. I mean, this guy, the guy of such courage, the guy who had such a principles in his life that he didn't leave the country when the danger was nearby, but just the opposite. So he stood and said his word about the government officials, and he was brutally murdered in prison. I mean, without Sergei courage, it would not be possible to move people in this direction. And the issue is that it's always about human story. I mean, you could tell many arguments why you should do something for or against, but only such heroes as him, which I would compare as a Nelson Mandela of Russia, is without stories like his story, you will never take people and convince them to do something. And then there were politicians in Congress, like Congressman McGovern, or senators like Senator Cardin, head of Helsinki Commission by then. He started something unbelievable, i.e. send a letter on behalf of the Helsinki Commission to the US government, asking to sanction specific people, specific 60 persons whom we had an evidence they were involved in mistreatment of Sergei Magnitsky. And again, coming back to what Bill already said, that before that, nobody was asking about any specific sanctions. And when the US government effectively ignored this request, then it became clear that only the law could be something which could change the situation. And when we start talking about it, when other politicians start talking about it, it became apparent that it's such an obvious idea. And it's actually underlined effectively the Western principles, the human rights protection, that the human life is one of the most value, that there were not too much opposition of it. I mean, there were minor oppositions where the kind of Russian lobbyists tried to play with it, just take down the Sergei Magnitsky name out of it or anything like that. But there were no too much opposition, at least among politicians, because it was such an obvious idea, which didn't come to mind for such a long period of time. And effectively, the major discussions about the Sergei Magnitsky Act, the original act in 2012, was mainly about certain senators were proposing already at that time to extend it wider, not only Russian act, but actually worldwide act. And this is what happened with the approval of Global Magnitsky Act in 2016.
And you mentioned there that one of the challenges was that governments want to have this complete control over whom they sanction, whom they don't sanction. And in the Q&A, or rather the chat function here, there are quite a few questions about double standards, why person X has been sanctioned and person Y from another country hasn't been sanctioned. Bill spoke about this universe of bad human rights abusers and good human rights abusers. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts about that challenge in the implementation of the Magnitsky Act? Is this just an inevitable feature of sanctions that governments will to some extent do what they will? Or is there a way for civil society to try and steer them in a more principled direction?
The whole idea of the law is exactly was done for that particular reason, so that the society, politicians has at least some say in this process. Because before that, it was complete discretion of the government what they're gonna do or what they will not do at all. And if you look, for example, at Sergei Magnitsky Accountability Act, there is even certain reporting requirements on behalf of the government to US Congress of what they've been doing, why, and so on and so forth. And actually, it's also resulted in appearance of a certain process when effectively certain protocols were developed, how the information about these human rights abusers should be presented to the governments. And of course, there are, it's not perfect by any means, and it should be improved, but at least it gives you some way, some kind of door where you could knock just to start this process against human rights abusers. Talking about subjectivity of these decisions, of course, any government is very subjective, and they have the kind of say in who is finally sanctioned and who is not. But again, by making this process more public than it ever been before, we are allowing kind of public opinion to influence the government. And at the end of the day, if we are not happy with the government, at least in the Western world, we need to re-elect it.
Yeah. And I would just like encourage everyone to keep posting their questions for this conversation with Vadim. We'll also have a dedicated segment for Q&A where you'll be able to ask your questions as well. But in the meantime, please feel free to feed them through. One other thing I wanted to raise, again, building on from something that you and Bill have both spoken about, there has been this extraordinary success story in the sense of more and more countries saying, okay, we agree, it's a good idea, we'll have our Magnitsky legislation, and then sometimes not much happens by way of implementation. Sometimes the criteria are a bit perhaps different from what some people were advocating for. And as you, in a sense, take stock of all those developments over the past decade and a half, what would you say are the big priorities for future advocacy in this space? Is it getting more countries on board, more active implementation in the countries that have legislation in place, more of the above, any of the specific more technical asks that you have, better enforcement in terms of finding the assets, and how do you think about this sort of universe of potential actions?
So I would draw your attention to two probably major areas. One of them is synchronization of these legislations. As Bill mentioned, for example, the EU laws of Magnitsky type of sanctions, they actually lack the corruption accusations. And again, as we know, for many dictatorship, human rights is actually coincide with the corruption to start with, and they are quite often about money. And so without adding it to European Magnitsky law, it's obviously a big gap which is being used by many of these corrupt officials and human rights violators. The other stuff, I think that it should be, in terms of enforcement, it's, I think one of the key areas should be going after the nominees and various enablers who actually, with probably secondary sanctions, who actually allows them or making it easier for them to avoid sanctions. I mean, the whole idea that there is so much effort needs to be done to avoid sanctions, just building additional structures, finding nominees and hiding money and so on, tells you that how painful it is for those who are sanctioned. But on the other hand, to make it even more painful for them, we need to go after those nominees. And actually, if you look at the provisions of the law, there is certain wording about it, at least in US legislation. So again, it's more an effort which needs to be done by the government to go after them. And then it will be even more effective. As Bill mentioned, the whole idea of this sanction is not only about people who already sanctioned. It has much bigger impact on those who has not been sanctioned. And I think that this probably influence is bigger than anything else. And this is like with any law, with any justice. When the law is applied, you usually not punish each and everybody who did something. But at least the sound examples of someone being punished is actually making a threat and for those who has not been punished yet.
And Vadim, just to perhaps echo and emphasize your point about going after nominees, I think those people on the call who haven't sort of lived and breathed the world of sanctions might not realize, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but effectively when a government sanctions someone, the government puts out a press release with a bunch of identifying details. That's what government sanctions are. Vadim Kleiner is sanctioned. Here is his date of birth. Here's his address. If you're a bank, go and see if you have an account in his name. And very often banks would just do what they call sanction screening, when they would look at whether they have, let's say, an account for Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un, and they would say, no accounts for Vladimir Putin, nothing for Kim Jong-un, job done. But of course, we know those people will not hold money or other assets in their own names. It will be employees and friends and family members and so on. And professional nominees. So how are those people identified? What are the regulatory requirements for banks and other businesses to identify those nominees? And how does the system work in order to freeze that property? And it actually boggles the mind that very often when you talk to government stakeholders about those issues, they recognize that it's just too difficult. And it's an extraordinary challenge, I think, across all countries. So definitely something that, certainly from my standpoint of doing academic research in this area, ought to be a major area of focus.
Yes, definitely. But we could see how the global picture changed for the last, let's say, 10 years to start with. So effectively, you're absolutely correct that originally when the government sanctions someone, this person is just mentioned by his or her name and his or her details. But the interesting world where we live in, everything is actually in a digital form now. And banks, when we are talking about banks, first of all, they are not searching themselves usually for that type of stuff. They have outsources. And outsources is like databases like WorldCheck or any specific companies which are attracted more and more now by financial institutions to do these checks on the people who are potential clients. And which means that if you are sanctioned by any country effectively in the world, it means that your name will end up in hundreds, if not thousands, of these databases being used by financial institutions. And this is about the impact of these sanctions. So if you are sanctioned only by Canada, but still your name end up in those institutions who are providing outsourcing information about QIC. Second, I mean, during the last 10 years, we also experienced unbelievable increase in journalism, let's put it, or investigative journalism, which we never ever experienced before. Panama Papers, all these unity kind of union of journalists from all over the world which are working on huge leaked databases of information and then publish them simultaneously, like in 70 countries. And then making a database which allows you to search for various type of information. It's actually, and then punishment of big banks for being involved in this money laundering. And you could name many examples of that. All this put additional pressure and additional encouragement for them to be much more thorough in terms of their QIC. And you didn't mention that, but as a part of our Sergei Magnitsky Global Justice campaign, we also following the money which Sergei Magnitsky uncovered, which was stolen from the Russian budget. And as such, we opened a criminal investigation in 17 countries worldwide. So it's pretty unprecedented for any, even law enforcement, not even say about NGO, which we are de facto. And we found this money in many jurisdictions. And in these jurisdictions, especially if we are talking about Baltic countries or Cyprus or any other place, we could see the quite big development in terms of the anti-money laundering fight. So if back in like mid-2000, Baltic countries were actually a heaven for any money laundering. Now we're talking about Latvia or Estonia, which actually brought to life huge money laundering cases, which are now considered by the court, first ever in their history, and especially of such scale, we're talking about $1.5 and $2 billion in both countries. But on top of that, the regulation itself and QIC in the banks became so robust that it's much more difficult to open for money launderers the accounts and use these accounts in a huge scale. The other scandal, which again started with our investigation of Danske Bank, which allegedly laundered 200 billion euros, actually yet another example of it.
Yeah, and just on that note, sanctions evasion, pursuing that topic, got a question from Mubashar in the chat. How about a sanctioned person changing their names using a fake identity? Another sanctions evasion technique. Are you, something you've encountered?
It's absolutely a brilliant question and brilliant example. That's why we need the public to observe what is happening. And if journalists or NGO will find out it, I think they have all the capacity to inform the relevant governments which impose sanction on this person, that this person has changed his or her name, and this should be applicable to this new name as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And by the way, just to add to that, with the introduction of biometrics, it's getting much more difficult now to have several names or several identities to find behind them.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a comment here. I'm just going to read it out and then invite for your views, Vadim, on this sort of theme. A comment from Serena Lillywhite, who's been closely involved with Transparency International here in Australia. Totally agree. We do need to go after nominees. That's why Australia needs a public register of beneficial ownership disclosure to help capture not just the gatekeepers, lawyers and accountants, but more disclosure of business structures regarding beneficial owners and politically exposed persons. So I don't suppose that you follow religiously the developments in Australia, but I was hoping to ask you perhaps a broader question about the role that countries like Australia, Canada, the EU can and should be playing in this world of Magnitsky sanctions, especially amidst the inevitable uncertainty, angst, whatever word you want to use in relation to Trump 2.0. How do you envisage the role of this network of countries committed to the rule of law at this moment when it comes to Magnitsky sanctions?
I mean, it's obviously of paramount importance, especially when the US, which used to be a pattern for other Western countries in their behavior in anti-corruption struggle and in fighting human rights abuses all over the world. Obviously, under the current administration, it's kind of out of their main interest, to say the least. And so with countries like Canada, Australia, UK, for that sake, and even the European Union need to play much bigger role in it. And this is no doubt. I mean, the whole Western world of freedom and democracy is actually built on the principles which needs to be supported. And without supporting them, we have erosion and corruption of the Western world. And this is what many dictatorships been doing for so many years. And that's why it's extremely important. And the disclosure of beneficial owners is obviously kind of a step in the right direction. And you know that many NGOs like Transparency International or investigative journalists call for that, and public called for that for so many years. And for example, in UK, we have now the requirement of disclosing the real estate beneficial ownership, which is a great step forward. And obviously it's needed in every country. And it was quite disappointing when several years ago the law was approved, or not the law, one of the challenges which was made in the European Court of Justice, which successfully actually made a step back, allowing to close certain beneficial ownership registries, like what has happened in Cyprus. But I think, as Vladimir Lenin said, we have one step back and two steps forward. So hopefully it will end up with a full transparency and disclosure, at least in the Western world overall.
Another question about the role of the broader world, as it were, other countries around the globe. Are there any smaller Pacific Island countries who have already adopted a Magnitsky Act? So we've heard about...
Yes, as Bill mentioned, it's Cayman Islands, for example, and some other foreign British territories which followed the actually mainland route and approve those laws. I mean, as I understand, currently they're just trying to repeat what was done by the UK in terms of people who was imposed and so on. But it doesn't mean that they could make their own steps. Again, it depends on the public pressure. As you know, the politicians should be shamed into action. So people who are on this call are those type of people who could definitely shame them into action.
Yeah, and that is a nice segue into, I suppose, one of the sort of last big questions I wanted to ask you. So a lot of people on this call represent NGOs, civil society groups of various descriptions in various countries. So I think quite a lot of attendees come not just from Australia, but the broader region, India, and so on. And so you have this unique experience of pushing the government, or first pushing Congress to adopt legislation, parliaments in other countries, pushing governments to implement it. So you sort of have a master's or a PhD in shaming governments into action. And so I was wondering if there are any broad lessons from that that you feel can be applied across multiple countries. How do you galvanize the government into action when they're kind of not, frankly, all that interested in all this human rights-y sanctioning stuff?
I mean, it's always about particular stories, particular shocking stories about how the government the money were misused or the human rights were violated of certain people. And only these human stories actually draw much attention. This is when you have journalists writing about it, when your story being read or retold many times. But again, without activity of this representative of public society, nothing would ever happen. This is our main lesson for the last 15 years and of what we have been doing. Without us going to politicians telling them this story, nobody would be attracted to it, and nobody will be find the courage to go with the new laws. And the same happened with the investigative journalism, when people were telling stories about Panama Papers and disclosing how the government officials of various countries were involved in different type of corruptions. No investigation would ever happen without involvement of these people.
Yeah, which is in a sense a daunting takeaway, because so much work is involved. On the other hand, it is empowering, and it feels like in your case there was the slow progress, and then suddenly all those countries sort of came around, and you got an explosion in the number of Magnitsky laws around the world. So it's an interesting trajectory. I feel that we might move into the proper Q&A session with people raising their hands if you'd like to ask a question live. I'm going to keep track of the participants to see any hands that have been raised. I see in the meantime we do have a couple of other questions in the chat. One question, quite an interesting one. I feel the Dean is not enthusiastic for the implementation of the Magnitsky Act, nor optimistic for its efficacy. Feels like it's the other way around. You do seem to...
No, not at all. I mean, just to give you some example, after global Magnitsky law was adopted in the United States, I just look at the statistics. There are people who were sanctioned from 70 countries all over the world, of more than 750 people. And you can't even imagine how many stories we heard personally when people approaching us, like from Africa or from Asia, saying that we are so thankful to you for Magnitsky sanctions, because before that, we didn't have any hope at all that the person who were torturing my brother or torturing my sister or doing something wrong in my own country will ever been sanctioned, or the attention will be drawn to this. Effectively, when you talk about justice, I mean, of course, it's not a final justice, but this sanction actually draw attention of the world attention to what is happening in this particular country. And before existence or appearance of this law, there was no chance to draw attention to what is happening in some small country in Asia or in Africa, and all type of terrible things happening there.
Yeah, and I think just to emphasize this point, one of the pieces of research I did a couple of years ago looked at some of the Magnitsky designations, and to your point, the array of countries involved is truly extraordinary. And I think that is actually one of the counter arguments to people who say that those sanctions will inevitably disrupt diplomatic relations with country X if you sanction people from it. And I think the reality is, well, they won't, because you won't just focus on country X. There are so many human rights abusers around the world. You're going to sanction, people from all countries in the world, and it's fine. It's not like
yes. I mean, you could see on U.S. sanctions people from Belgium or Israel, which are friendly countries, and so on. I mean, we're talking about specific people. I mean, the strength of Magnitsky sanctions, that you're not going up, after governments per se, or you're not going after the countries per se. You are going after specific people for their specific wrongdoings.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a question from Bernard Kaleri, who's a well-known lawyer here in Canberra. Bernard, I was wondering if I might perhaps ask you to ask your own question, perhaps to unpack it a bit for those who are not au fait with the intricacies of Australian sanctions legislation. If you could perhaps just describe the import of your question, explain it a bit, I'd be grateful.
Yes, thank you, Anton. Very often the information that can be agitated under the global legislation is acquired by law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And that information, for necessary reasons, may need to be censored, redacted, and limited. But where there is a clear breach of the norms, particularly that involve deprivation of human rights or contributions to misery, I won't give any immediate examples. The Australian legislation limits disclosure to the CEO of the agency that's become aware of the Magnitsky Act type conduct. And that is a fetter when a government CEO is unwilling to disclose, fails to disclose, or seeks approval from a government that might be complicit in the conduct. And I can give a specific example because I'm well known for that, but I won't go into that. I'm very interested in how and whether other countries have imposed the same limitation on disclosure as we have in Australia, limiting it to the head, say, of the intelligence agency, who may very well be a government appointee, who may be complicit in the conduct. That's my question, Anton.
Thank you.
I mean, unfortunately, it's always the case. And we have European legislation and UK legislation, so-called GDPR, which actually talking about the confidentiality of personal data and so on and so forth. And it always a kind of a balance which needs to be found in terms of public interest, public importance of this information or its disclosure. And I think that you're absolutely right. And this is obvious deficiency. And probably it should be addressed maybe through Australian politicians with certain amendments or proposed amendments either to the law or to the government of what should be disclosed. And again, the idea of hiding the whole institution behind one person is definitely not a good one. And again, it depends on the severity of the violation. If violation is really tough, I mean, the more information that could be disclosed must be disclosed, because we are talking about the lesson. It's what about justice? Justice is about lesson for the society of what was wrong and who was responsible. And if it's hidden behind some kind of big name and big institution, it's obvious there's obviously no reason.
Yes, thank you. I quite agree.
Thank you, Bernard, for raising that. And if I may ask a follow-up question from that, I was wondering, Vadim, if you could tell us a bit more about the sources of information that designations are typically based on. In your case, you've done a painstaking job of collecting information and presenting it to different governments around the world. I suppose in some cases, this sort of power behind the scenes, for lack of a better term, or this sort of concerted effort might not be available. There wouldn't necessarily always be someone with the resources and energy of Bill Browder to do it, but there would still be some information available about human rights abuse in a particular country. And so do you have a sense of how governments normally collect that information to then base a designation on?
So first of all, I would give you an example based on our investigation of Sergei Magnitsky death. I mean, there are kind of three leverage of this story. So one is actually of people who are connected to the case to be active. When you are filing numerous complaints to the authorities, it's not always about the fact that you are expecting that there will be justice from them. But by getting the answers, you are getting actually the evidential base for this type of sanctions. So even if some government official is replying to you that there is no crime was committed, nobody was killed, or there was no torture there, or he was beaten but there's no torture, and so on and so forth. But by getting all these answers, sometimes which sounds ridiculous to you, but it's actually some kind of input for future sanctions under Magnitsky legislation in other countries. Second is obviously attracting public attention through journalists and NGOs. Like in Magnitsky case, there were numerous number of articles written about all type of independent media at that time. And this was also the evidential basis for future investigations under Magnitsky sanctions from other countries. Finally, as you mentioned today, there was Human Rights Council, consist of human rights activists who actually issued quite a significant and quite dramatic report about the conditions in which Sergei was kept in the Russian prison, his mistreatment, and so on and so forth. And all this happened because of the activity of public activists, because of activity of his family, because of activity of his friends, and so on and so forth. So all these actions are needed for collecting evidence.
And in terms of that evidence collection part of it, sanctions are one game in town, criminal prosecutions are another, civil forfeiture is yet another. And I know you've been running very publicly, very effectively, a multi-pronged campaign seeking to achieve justice. And I was wondering if you could speak to the effect of sanctions on those other components of your efforts. So after the Magnitsky Act came into being, did you feel that your other efforts were advanced by it? And when you went to
Yes, I think this kind of two sides of the story, which one is strengthening the other. So when we were going to any specific countries where we found the process of this enormous crime to be transferred to, we always mentioned the Magnitsky legislation as a kind of way to draw attention to the case. I mean, when you're talking about officials in this particular country, they have thousands of cases sitting on their table, and usually they are overburdened with their job and probably do not draw attention to it. But with this sound case, it actually helps to draw the attention. And that's why we had such a big development in many countries. Like in States, there was found money which from this crime which were used to buy property in Manhattan. And there was a criminal investigation opened by US Department of Justice, which was finally settled for $6 million, which was triple the amount used to buy the property. Or, for example, there was a French investigation. Again, after almost 6 years of investigation, they convicted the women who received the money, and also the bank who transferred the money to the French territory, which was notoriously famous Danske Bank Estonia, and so on and so forth. With this kind of public attention which we've got with our cases, we probably got much more attention compared to any other cases of money laundering of any other sort. And this obviously end up with the big investigations with the investigative journalists. First, when we found that Estonian branch of Danske Bank was involved in actually laundering a big part of this 230 million, we could never imagine that the further analysis conducted together with the support of investigative journalists could reveal that we are talking about effectively institution which was laundering billions, and as we finally learned from the public investigations, hundreds of billions.
Just encouraging people again to raise hands if they've got any questions. In the meantime, there's a comment in the chat that touches on something that I feel we've addressed but perhaps haven't emphasized enough. And the comment is to the effect, okay, well, you're just talking about Russia. What about, for example, Africa? You know, what was the relevance of all of this to other parts of the world? So perhaps, Vadim, if we could just focus on that, you know, it's not just about Russia and Russian groups, right? There are many, many other countries that have been...
Of course. I have a list in front of me, and there are all type of African countries here. You could see Uganda, Kenya, Angola, and so on and so forth, who were Cote d'Ivoire. So people from these countries being sanctioned by the global Magnitsky Act in US. So it was definitely applicable, and it is applicable to African countries. And some of the Europeans were even sanctioned for their misdeeds in Africa, like some Belgian businessmen or Israeli ones. So it's obviously that in Africa we have enormous examples of inefficiencies, corruptions, and human rights abuse. So, and obviously it should be attracted. And this is why the whole Magnitsky legislation exists. And actually, the first example when we heard about people thanking us for this legislation existence was poor people from Africa.
Yeah. And I think one of the more interesting sort of sagas of the past couple of years was the designation of the Israeli businessman that you alluded to, Dan Girdler, for his activities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, first sanctioned by one US administration, then he was granted a license that enabled him to carry out his transactions by another administration. And then I to be honest, I've lost track of what's going on with this case, but it's been a bit of a seesaw with those developments, as he's been clearly trying to fight sanctions. And one thing that I think we feel we probably ought to mention is the efforts to which people on the receiving end of sanctions go in challenging them. And those challenges sort of unfold on different planes, right? So we've got judicial challenges, and we've seen some of those in Australia with two Russian businessmen attempting to challenge Australian sanctions in court, not being successful. But we also see those things happening behind the scenes, as it were, with petitioning the government saying, I was unjustly sanctioned. Could you please remedy this injustice? And so I was wondering, Vadim, if you could speak a bit to that aspect of it. How do people try to get out of sanctions? Do they succeed? Do they not succeed? How does that process unfold?
I mean, we obviously see enormous lobbying efforts from that sake, and people are spending hundreds of thousands on lobbying activities, both in Washington, London, and other places, trying to fight sanctions against them. And there were even some scandals with the representatives of UK Parliament who were involved in this type of activity. And we know even that some of the criminals whom we are going after from Russia, they were employing people from Palace of Lords even just to help them with their lobbying activity, both in UK and in Brussels. And the fact that they are spending so much effort and so much time and money for that shows to you how efficient these sanctions are. Effectively, the flip coin of the efforts is effectively another evidence that these sanctions are very efficient, and they're doing a lot of efforts to get out of them.
Yeah. Well, they've certainly generated quite an industry, right, of people challenging sanctions, if nothing else. Serena, you've got your hand up.
Yes, hello, and hello, Vadim. Thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up on the point about dirty money and money laundering. I guess everybody loves and hates a good dirty money laundering story, whether it's investment in the property sector in Australia, or fancy yachts, or fancy handbags, or or so forth. For many, many years, in fact, 16, 17 years, Australia has been the go-to destination for dirty money because our anti-money laundering laws haven't been up to scratch. And thankfully, under the current government that we've got some strengthened anti-money laundering laws, which does put a bit more pressure on the real estate agents as enablers, but the lawyers and accountants are still slipping off the hook a little bit. So do you have any comment or observations on how we can better align anti-money laundering laws with the sanctions laws, I guess, because they seem a little bit disconnected at times?
So obviously, all this money laundering would not be possible without Western enablers. So they are playing the crucial role in it. And actually, I would say that in UK, the close attention to it happened probably about 6 or 7 years ago, when one of the leading TV channel made a documentary when they presented like a fake Russian deputy minister going with his nice-looking girlfriend around the most luxury properties.
All those beautiful houses in London, all those beautiful houses in London. It was actually a Transparency International bus tour. Yeah.
And discussing with the all type of lawyers, real estate agents, how he will be parking his kind of dirty money in with this real estate. And this type of approach actually was very sound, because finally this is draw so much attention to the whole story of kind of parking dirty money with British real estate, that it's end up with this disclosure requirements on the beneficial ownership and so on and so forth. But I think it's very important actually to make a next step and impose actually obligation on all these enablers, potential enablers, whether it's auditors, real estate agents, or lawyers, to disclose to the government if they are working with any of these people or close to the people who've been sanctioned. And effectively, this will be yet another warning for them of what might happen if they will continue this type of work. And in terms of selecting their clients for the future, they will think twice then if they would prefer to take someone who doesn't have any dirty tracks behind, or then they will be under scrutiny of the government because they are obliged to report this type of activity. So this is in a kind of a step of the, if not secondary sanctions, but at least more transparency in terms of who is working for these sanctioned people and so on.
Yeah, we have to get into that underbelly.
Exactly.
Thanks, Serena, and thanks, Vadim, for that. We've got a question that's country specific, so wonder to what extent you can address that one. But the question is, how should the EU, and presumably by extension other countries with Magnitsky sanctions, address the Myanmar's the military regime, so the regime in Myanmar? Any thoughts on that?
Definitely. I mean, no doubts. And if you could look at the global Magnitsky Act, there are already people from Myanmar, and I think that they are already for several years there. And I think that as soon as there will be proof of other of the atrocities, I think more people should be added. And definitely the NGOs should lobby for the involvement, inclusion in EU Magnitsky list. There is no doubt. And we have one of the most drastic regimes there, and therefore, without drawing attention to it, nothing ever will change, and people will not feel even a small flavor of justice if they were not punished by Magnitsky sanction, at least.
Yeah, it's one of the very few games in town, as I think Bill mentioned.
And just to address the question which probably was raised before to Bill, that it's not a final justice, it's not a real justice, and so on and so forth. Of course it is not. But first of all, if we are just trying to put a scale of complete justice and no justice at all, it's something in between. And first of all, and it gives people some hope. But more than that, it draws people's attention. It draws public's attention to what's happening. And as we already discussed today, it's actually quite threatening to people who are end up on sanctions. And even more importantly, it's threatening not only to people who are not who are already on sanctions, but a huge category which could be on these sanctions. And finally, probably to add the final point to it, at the end of the day, we could expect that earlier or later, the kind of final justice could appear. And these public stories, when people being sanctioned already for these atrocities, actually will add up the picture or future picture for future justice.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, the extent of progress here has been tremendous, and it is a momentous development in human rights, for sure. Just giving people the opportunity to gather thoughts for any final questions. We are edging towards the top of the hour. We've covered, I think, a lot of ground. It's been a tremendously rich discussion. Perhaps, Vadim, if I could ask you to add any final thoughts that you might have, anything that we haven't addressed, or anything that you'd like to leave our listeners or audience with. I think that would be a good thing to do, and then we'll hand over to Yasmin.
So it is my pleasure to speak today, and it's actually very energizing for me to see how many people are interested in the topic. And I pretty much encourage each of you to continue doing what you're doing. And this type of sanctions is actually the way to draw attention to different atrocities which are happening around the world. And without people like you, nothing would ever happen. So I encourage you to continue doing what you are doing. And this instrument, as Magnitsky sanctions, will probably grow and will probably increase in other countries. And the more attention will be drawn to human stories, the better, and the more justice we could expect at the final end. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Vadim. Energizing, probably more energizing for the audience. Really extraordinary. Loved it. A terrific presentation from you and Serbil as well. So thank you for that. And I'm just handing over to Yasmina, if I may, to wrap this up on behalf of START.
I was the person wrapping it up for today, but thank you, Anton, and thank you very much, Vadim, and big thanks to Serbil. It's fantastic to see everyone's engagement and many questions. I know that we didn't get to all the questions, but I think, Claire, there's some really good questions here that maybe we should seek to explore responding to at some stage. But we can save the chat, right? Yes, thank you everyone then for today. Thank you, Diplomacy Training Program, and see you at the next webinar. Does Patrick or Claire would like to say? Do you want to say what next webinar is? We are kind of almost there with it.
Yes, thank you very much, Jasmina. I can say thank you on behalf of the Diplomacy Training Programme to Vadim and to Bill and to Anton for putting this together, and to also the people who joined us today and for the discussion. We had nearly 400 people registering for this webinar, which I think may be a record for us, and it shows the level of interest, I think, in this topic and the issue of accountability for human rights violations and corruption that's linked with that too. So this is the first of a series of 3 webinars that we'll have focusing on the Magnitsky Act. In the next webinar next week, we'll be joined by people who've been using the legislation to reflect on how they've used it in particular situations, to try and draw some of the lessons from that. And then in the final webinar, again, we want to look back at the practicalities of how can this be a useful tool in a world where accountability for human rights abuses is all too lacking, and there is a lot of frustration, a lot of disappointment in using the state-based systems through the UN. So we're really looking for practical things that we can give to victims and to survivors, to those that work in solidarity with them also. And so this is the first part of that conversation, and it builds on the previous webinars we've done. So thank you again, Vadim. Thank you to Bill. Thank Anton for excellent facilitation, and to everybody who was able to join us this evening, this morning, and wherever from all over. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.